Robert unlocked the heavy oak door of the wine cellar exactly at 6 in the morning, the heavy click of the deadbolt echoing like a gunshot in the silence of the basement, expecting to find a shivering, broken woman begging for his forgiveness after 12 hours in the freezing dark. He leaned against the frame with that familiar, terrifying smirk, certain that the bite of the subterranean cold had finally frozen the rebellion out of my veins, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a single tear or a tremble. I simply walked past him, my bare feet numb against the concrete, and went straight upstairs to the kitchen to grind the beans for his morning espresso as if I hadn't spent the night huddled under a burlap sack praying for warmth. He froze mid-step when the doorbell rang, much earlier than scheduled a floral delivery. He hadn't ordered, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his face, because for the first time in 10 years he couldn't predict the rhythm of his own house. He stared at my back as I poured the boiling water, slowly realizing that this morning my silence wasn't an act of surrender, but the quiet, accumulating weight of a judge reading a death sentence. You know, that specific kind of quiet that settles over a house after a storm, the kind that feels less like peace and more like a landmine waiting for the pressure of a footstep. That is what life in the Ellington estate feels like every single day, a pristine architectural digest masterpiece, where the marble countertops are always cold and the air is always thin, stripped of oxygen by a man who consumes everything in his orbit. To the neighbors in our gated community, I am Claire, the trophy wife, the former waitress who won the lottery by marrying Robert Ellington, the philanthropist, the pillar of the community who rescued me from debt and obscurity. They see the manicured lawns and the imported cars, but they don't see the price tag attached to the velvet handcuffs, nor do they understand that a golden cage is still just a cage until you find the key. I used to believe in that fairy tale too, the myth of the savior, until I realized that he didn't marry me to love me. He married me because he needed a buffer, a soft object to absorb the blows intended for his son Leo. But last night, when the smell of burning paper filled the living room, something inside me finally snapped, transforming my fear into a cold, hard resolve that no amount of freezing temperatures could shatter. It started with a piece of paper, a thin envelope from the Rhode Island School of Design that Leo had hidden under his mattress for weeks, a beacon of hope that he could escape his father's suffocating shadow and become the artist he was born to be. I remember the look in Leo's eyes when he showed it to me, a mixture of terrifying hope and paralyzing dread, his 18-year-old hands shaking as he whispered that he got a full scholarship, that he didn't need Robert's money, that he could finally be free. But walls in this house have ears, and Robert walked in just as the word freedom hung in the air, his face twisting from that public mask of benevolence into the private monster we both knew too well. He didn't yell. Robert never yells, because yelling is for the lower class. He just walked over, snatched the acceptance letter and Leo's sketchbook, the one with the charcoal drawings that proved his genius, and walked calmly to the fireplace where the logs were crackling. He tossed them in like garbage, and when I saw Leo's soul curling into ash, I didn't think. I just lunged, thrusting my hands into the flames to pull out whatever I could, searing my skin to save a few charred pages of my stepson's dreams. The physical pain of the fire was immediate and blinding, but it was nothing compared to the cold fury in Robert's eyes when he saw me defy him, dragging me by the hair away from the hearth, while Leo screamed, pinned against the wall by his own terror. He threw me into the wine cellar, the temperature controlled to a perfect 50 degrees for the vintage reds, but deadly for a woman in a silk nightgown, and locked the door with a promise that if I made a sound, Leo would be on a bus to a military reform school in Alabama by noon the next day. I spent the night huddled in the corner, blowing warm air onto my blistered hands, listening to the hum of the cooling unit, and thinking about the irony of freezing to death surrounded by 3,000 bottles of wine worth more than my life. But somewhere between the shivering and the darkness, the tears stopped falling, and a strange clarity took over, a realization that the woman who begged for mercy died in that cellar, and the woman who walked out was someone entirely different. I looked at my injuries in the reflection of a dusty bottle of Pinot Noir and decided that these weren't wounds. They were evidence. And today was the day the jury would finally see them. Now standing in the kitchen, the warmth of the sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows feels like a lie, a bright veneer over the rot, as I apply heavy concealer over the bruise on my cheekbone and carefully wrap my burned hand in a silk scarf, fashioning it into a stylish accessory. Robert enters the kitchen dressed in his Italian suit, looking every inch the grieving widower doing his best to raise a rebellious son and manage a clumsy young wife, and he sits at the head of the table waiting for his coffee and his apology. He taps his watch, reminding me that his former mother-in-law, Margaret the matriarch who controls the family trust, will be arriving at noon for Leo's birthday lunch, and everything must be perfect to ensure she signs over the next tranche of the inheritance. "Make sure you wear long sleeves, Claire," he says, without looking up from his tablet. "We don't want Margaret thinking you're clumsy again. She already thinks you're unfit for this family." I place the cup down in front of him, my movements precise and mechanical, suppressing the urge to pour the scalding liquid into his lap, and simply nod. "Of course, Robert, everything will be perfect." My voice so steady it scares even me. He finishes his coffee confident that order has been restored, that the fear of losing the lifestyle he provides has once again silenced me, and he stands up to leave for the office for a few hours before the party, pausing only to remind me to prep the roast. As the garage door closes and his Porsche roars away, the silence returns, but this time it isn't heavy. It is electric, charged with the frantic energy of a countdown that only I can hear. I don't start the roast. Instead, I walk to the intercom and buzz Leo's room, telling him to pack only what matters. Then I turn to the hidden wall safe behind the pantry, shelving the one Robert thinks I don't know the combination to. I dial in the numbers, his birthday of course, because narcissists never change, and the heavy metal door swings open, revealing not just cash, but the stacks of financial documents that prove he has been bleeding Leo's trust fund dry for years. I take the papers, my burned hand throbbing in rhythm with my heart, and I carry them to the dining room table, placing them right next to the fine china. Because today, we aren't just serving lunch, we are serving justice, and it is going to be served cold. The fluorescent lights of the master bathroom hummed with a clinical brightness that made no attempt to hide the ugly reality of my reflection in the expansive gold-framed mirror, revealing a woman who looked less like the mistress of a high-end estate and more like a survivor of a natural disaster. I turned on the faucet, the water rushing out crystal clear and freezing cold, and I forced my trembling hands underneath the stream, biting down on a hand towel to stifle the scream that clawed at my throat as the icy water hit the raw, blistered skin of my palms. This was the first step of the ritual, the necessary purification before the sacrifice. And as I watched the dead skin and soot wash away into the marble basin, I realized that the Claire who used to cry in this bathroom, the girl who believed that if she just cooked better or dressed nicer she could fix him, had finally drained away with the dirty water. I dried my hands with excruciating slowness, applying a thick layer of medical ointment I kept hidden in a hollowed-out jar of expensive face cream, and then I looked myself in the eye, seeing not fear, but a cold, vacant stillness that frightened me more than Robert ever could. The bruise on my cheek was blooming into a violent shade of purple, a dark flower on pale soil, and I reached for the heavy-duty concealer, layering it on with the precision of an artist, restoring a damaged painting, erasing the violence, until the face looking back at me was once again the perfect porcelain doll Robert had purchased. I left the sanctuary of the bathroom and moved silently down the hallway, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of my footsteps as I approached Leo's door, which was slightly ajar, leaking a sliver of gray light into the corridor. Inside the room, was a chaotic landscape of panic. An open suitcase lay on the bed, half filled with crumpled clothes, and Leo was frantically shoving his few remaining art supplies into a backpack, his movements jerky and terrified like an animal sensing a trap. He didn't hear me enter, and when I placed my hand on his shoulder, he jumped, spinning around with wild eyes that instantly softened into a heartbreaking mix of relief and shame when he saw it was only me. "I can't stay, Claire," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He's going to send me away. I heard him on the phone with the academy. They're coming for me on Monday." I looked at this boy who was technically my stepson, but spiritually the only thing keeping my heart beating, and I saw the charred remains of his sketchbook sitting on his desk, the one I had burned my hands to save, and I knew that running away now would only make him a fugitive, stripping him of the inheritance that was his birthright. I reached out with my bandaged hand, wincing slightly as I took the backpack from him and set it gently on the floor, shaking my head slowly. "You aren't going anywhere, Leo," I said, my voice barely audible but laced with a terrifying authority. "We don't run from monsters, we turn on the lights." Leaving Leo with a confused but hopeful silence, I descended the grand staircase to the kitchen, the heart of the house where I was expected to perform the domestic theater that Robert demanded for his audience. The menu for today was Robert's favorite beef Wellington, a dish that required patience, precision, and a level of dexterity that my injured hands were currently screaming against. I pulled the tenderloin from the refrigerator, the cold meat stinging my fingertips through the thin latex gloves I had put on to hide the bandages, and I began the rhythmic, hypnotic work of chopping mushrooms for the duxelles. Chop, chop, chop. Each slice of the knife sent a jolt of electricity up my arm, a sharp reminder of the fire from the night before. But I welcomed the pain because it kept me focused, kept me from drowning in the sheer terror of what I was about to do. I sautéed the mixture, the smell of butter and shallots filling the air, a comforting, homey scent that masked the rot at the center of this family, creating the perfect olfactory illusion for when Margaret would walk through the door. I rolled out the puff pastry, my movements deliberate and slow, treating the dough like the delicate skin of a lie I was wrapping around the ugly truth, ensuring that on the surface everything looked golden, flaky, and appetizing. The sharp, jarring ring of the landline on the kitchen wall shattered the culinary trance, and I knew before I picked it up that it was him checking in to ensure his puppets were on their strings. "Hello, darling." Robert's voice oozed through the receiver, smooth and confident, the voice of a man who believes he has already won. "I trust the house is presentable. Margaret is in a mood today, so make sure the wine is breathing." I gripped the phone with my shoulder, keeping my hands busy with the pastry so he wouldn't hear a tremor in my voice, and replied, "Everything is under control, Robert. The roast is in the oven." He paused, a silence that felt heavy with unsaid threats, before adding, "And Claire, wear the blue dress. The one with the long sleeves. We wouldn't want to upset your mother-in-law with your clumsiness." The audacity of his command, the way he turned his violence into my failing, sent a surge of bile up my throat, but I swallowed it down, forcing a smile that he couldn't see but could surely hear. "Of course," I said. "I'll cover everything up, just like always." I hung up the phone gently, severing the connection, and stared at the receiver for a moment, thinking about how satisfying it would be to wrap the cord around his neck before turning back to the oven. With the food prepared, I moved to the dining room to set the stage for the execution, laying out the fine china and polishing the silverware until it gleamed like surgical instruments. The centerpiece was a lush arrangement of white lilies, funeral flowers, though Robert would just see them as elegant. But the real centerpiece was the leather-bound photo album sitting on the sidebar, the gift we were supposed to present to Margaret to celebrate family memories. I opened the heavy book, flipping past the staged photos of our vacations in the Hamptons and Robert's charity galas, until I reached the back section, the pages reserved for the most recent memories. With trembling fingers, I took the stack of papers I had stolen from the safe, The bank statements showing the withdrawals, the transfers to offshore accounts, the emails to the gambling syndicates, and I carefully slid them between the photographs of Leo's childhood. It was a perfect hiding spot, a landmine buried in a field of nostalgia waiting for Margaret's sentimental fingers to detonate it. I closed the book, smoothing the leather cover, and stepped back to admire the table. It looked like a spread for a magazine, a testament to wealth and happiness, and no one looking at it would guess that it was actually a crime scene waiting to happen. I rushed upstairs to change the clock ticking down the final minutes before the guests arrived, and I slipped into the modest blue dress Robert had requested the silk cool against my skin. I stood before the full-length mirror one last time, checking the details, the high collar hiding the faint bruising on my neck, the long sleeves concealing the bandages on my hands and the finger marks on my arms. I applied a final coat of lipstick, a shade of red that matched the wine we would be serving, and practiced my smile, not the genuine smile of the girl I used to be, but the brittle, polite smile of a politician's wife. I heard the crunch of gravel on the driveway, the unmistakable sound of Robert's Porsche, followed by the heavier engine of Margaret's town car, and my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I took a deep breath, inhaling the silence of the room one last time, and then I picked up the small silver bell we used to summon dinner. It was time. I walked out of the room, leaving the door open, and descended the stairs to welcome the wolf, the judge, and the jury into my home. The heavy oak door swung open, ushering in a gust of crisp autumn air that smelled of dried leaves and expensive cologne, followed immediately by the booming, jovial voice of the man who had threatened to destroy my life less than an hour ago. Robert swept into the foyer with the grandeur of a returning king, guiding his former mother-in-law Margaret by the elbow with a tenderness that would bring a tear to the eye of anyone who didn't know he was capable of locking his wife in a freezing cellar. "Careful with the step, Margaret, we can't have the matriarch of the family twisting an ankle," he said, his voice dripping with that smooth, practiced charm that had once fooled me, too. Behind them trailed James, the family lawyer, a man whose spine seemed to have curved permanently from years of bending to the will of wealthy clients, clutching his briefcase as if it contained the nuclear codes. I stood by the staircase, my hands clasped tightly in front of my blue dress, to hide the tremors, watching Robert perform his greatest magic trick, the instant transformation from domestic tyrant to the benevolent, long-suffering provider. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and for a split second, the cold deadness of the shark flashed behind his pupils before the mask slid back into place. "And here is Claire," he announced, gesturing to me like I was a piece of furniture he had recently reupholstered. "Looking lovely as always, darling." Margaret paused, leaning heavily on her cane, and raked her gaze over me with the precision of a health inspector looking for a violation in a cheap diner. To her, I would never be the woman who loved her grandson. I was simply the waitress who had cleared her table 10 years ago, the opportunist who had swooped in to replace her deceased daughter and spend her family's money. "You're pale, Claire," she stated flatly, not as a concern, but as a criticism, handing me her heavy fur coat without making eye contact, expecting me to take it like the help I essentially was. "I hope you haven't been wasting Robert's money on those chemical peels. Vanity is an ugly trait in a woman of your background." I took the coat, the heavy fur pressing against my sore arms, and forced a polite smile, the kind that hurts the corners of your mouth. "It's just the lighting, Margaret," I replied, softly hanging the coat in the closet. "I've been busy in the kitchen. I wanted everything to be perfect for Leo." She scoffed, a dry, rattling sound. "Yes, well, let's hope the roast isn't as dry as the conversation usually is." James gave me a sympathetic, fleeting nod. He knew, or at least he suspected, what life was like in this house, but his salary depended on his silence. So he looked away, studying the crown molding with intense fascination. You know that feeling when you look at an old photograph of yourself and you can't quite recognize the person smiling back at you, like they are a stranger who just happens to wear your face? That is how I felt watching Robert pour drinks in the living room, laughing at Margaret's sharp-tongued jokes. because I was suddenly assaulted by the memory of the man I thought I had married. I remembered a rainy Tuesday night at the diner 6 years ago, a rude customer screaming at me because his coffee was cold, and Robert stepping in calm and authoritative, shaming the man into silence and leaving me $100 tip. He had looked at me then with such intense, focused validation, telling me I deserved better, that I was smart and kind and beautiful, and like a starving animal, I had devoured every scrap of affection he threw my way. It is the most dangerous trap in the world, isn't it? To fall in love with the mask, to believe that the man who saves you from the rain won't eventually become the storm. Watching him now, charming Margaret with stories of Leo's progress, I felt a wave of nausea not just from fear, but from the mourning of that illusion. The man who saved me never existed. He was just a role Robert played to acquire a new possession, and now that the possession was acquired, the actor had left the stage. Robert moved toward me under the pretense of checking the hors d'oeuvres, his body blocking me from the view of the guests in the living room. He picked up a canapé, inspecting it critically, and then leaned in close, his lips brushing my ear in a parody of intimacy. "You're shaking," he whispered, his voice low and devoid of the warmth he projected to the room. "Stop it. You look guilty." His hand moved to my waist, his fingers digging hard into the soft flesh of my side, a pinch sharp enough to bruise but hidden by his body and my dress. "If Leo steps one toe out of line today, if he says anything about the art school, I will personally drive him to the academy tonight. Do you understand?" I stiffened, the pain in my side radiating outward, but I didn't pull away. "He won't," I whispered back, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that made him blink. "He knows what's at stake. We all do." Robert studied me for a second, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, but unable to place it before patting my cheek with a patronizing tap. "Good girl. Go get the boy. It's time for the show." I turned to the stairs just as Leo appeared at the top of the landing, and my heart broke a little for the boy who had been forced to grow up too fast in the shadow of a narcissist. He was wearing a stiff suit that Robert had picked out, his hair combed back, looking like a miniature, terrified version of his father, but his eyes were red-rimmed and darting nervously. He gripped the banister, his knuckles white, looking down at the gathering like a prisoner walking to the gallows. I walked up a few steps to meet him, blocking him from his father's line of sight for a brief moment. "Breathe," I mouthed, reaching out to straighten his tie, my bandaged fingers clumsy but gentle against the silk. "Remember what I said. The lights." Leo looked at me, fear warring with trust, and then he took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. We descended together, and Robert boomed, "There he is, the man of the hour," opening his arms wide. Leo walked into the embrace stiff as a board, and I saw Robert's hand clap onto the boy's shoulder, the fingers squeezing just a little too hard, a silent reminder of who owned whom. "Lunch is served," I announced, my voice ringing out clearer than I expected, cutting through the tension. We moved into the dining room, the crystal chandelier casting a fractured light over the table I had set with the precision of a surgeon. Margaret took the seat of honor, James to her right, and Robert at the head, leaving Leo and me on the opposite side. It was a perfect tableau of the American upper class. The silver gleamed, the lilies were fragrant, and the beef Wellington sat golden and heavy in the center. But all I could see was the leather-bound photo album sitting on the sideboard, innocuous and heavy, waiting for its moment. Margaret settled her napkin in her lap and looked around the table, her eyes landing on the album. "And what is that?" she asked, pointing with a manicured finger. "Another one of your scrapbooks, Claire. I hope it's not full of pictures of your cats." Robert laughed, pouring the wine. "Oh no, Margaret." Claire insisted on putting together a retrospective for Leo's 18th. "A walk down memory lane." I smiled, taking my seat, and placed my hands gently on the table, wincing slightly as the edge pressed against my burns. "Yes," I said, looking directly at Robert. "It's important to remember exactly how we got here." The serrated edge of the carving knife rasped against the silver platter, a harsh metallic shriek that made Leo flinch in his seat. Though Robert continued his work with the rhythmic precision of a surgeon performing a lobotomy. "You see, Margaret," Robert said, his voice rich and baritone, layering slice after perfect slice of pink beef onto the china plates. "It hasn't been easy raising a boy in this climate. The world today, it makes them soft. It tells them they can be whatever they want even if they have no aptitude for it." He paused to place a generous portion in front of his mother-in-law, offering her a charming dimpled smile that didn't quite reach his shark-like eyes. "I've had to be the bad guy. I've had to be the anchor. I've sacrificed my own comfort, my own peace of mind, just to ensure Leo has the structure he desperately needs." Margaret nodded sympathetically, cutting into her meat with dainty aristocratic movements, completely oblivious to the fact that the structure Robert spoke of was a prison cell built of psychological warfare. "You're a Saint Robert," she murmured, ignoring me entirely as I passed the gravy boat. "My poor daughter. She never had your strength. She would have let the boy run wild." I sat in silence, my hands folded in my lap to hide the tremors that were starting to radiate from my burned palms up to my shoulders, watching the steam rise from the Wellington like the fog of war. I looked across the table at Leo, who was staring at his plate as if it were a baffling alien artifact, his shoulders hunched in a posture of permanent defeat. Robert wasn't finished. He never is until he has extracted a public confession of gratitude from his victims. He turned his gaze to his son, pointing the tip of the carving knife casually in Leo's direction. "Tell your grandmother about the academy." "Leo." Robert commanded, his tone conversational, but the threat unmistakable. "Tell her how excited you are to finally learn some real discipline in Alabama." The air in the room seemed to vanish. I saw Leo's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed dryly, his eyes darting to me for a fraction of a second, a silent plea for rescue. But I didn't move. I couldn't save him by speaking for him. I had to save him by letting the trap snap shut around the hunter. Leo stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "I think it will be good for me." "Speak up, boy," Robert said, his voice dropping an octave, a low rumble of thunder before the strike. "Don't mumble. It's disrespectful to your grandmother." The tension at the table was sudden and suffocating, thick enough to choke on. Margaret frowned, finally sensing the discord but interpreting it through her lens of prejudice. "Honestly, Leo," she sighed, "you're 18. Stop cowering like a child. Your father is spending a fortune on this education." That was the trigger word. Fortune. I saw my opening. I stood up, grabbing the heavy crystal decanter of Cabernet Sauvignon, my movements a little too quick, a little too jerky. "Let me refill that for you, Robert," I said, moving to his side. As I poured, I allowed the throbbing pain in my right hand, the hand he had forced into the fire, to dictate my motor control. My fingers spasmed just a twitch, but enough to send a darkly crimson splash of wine cascading over the rim of the glass and onto the pristine white cuff of Robert's Italian dress shirt. The reaction was instantaneous. Robert recoiled as if I had thrown acid on him, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "Damn it, Claire!" The mask slipped for a heartbeat, just a heartbeat, revealing the snarl of the beast beneath the face that had watched me freeze in the cellar. Margaret gasped, clutching her pearls, and James the lawyer looked up from his plate with wide eyes. But Robert, ever the master manipulator, caught himself. He saw the audience. He took a deep breath, forcing his facial muscles back into a semblance of patience, though his jaw remained tight enough to snap steel. It's fine." He gritted out, dabbing at the stain with his napkin, the red liquid blooming like a fresh wound on the white fabric. "Accidents happen. Claire has been unwell lately. Her hands are shaking." He looked at me with a warning glare that promised retribution later, but I didn't look down. I met his eyes. "I am so sorry, Robert," I said, my voice dripping with false contrition. "I suppose I'm just nervous. with the tuition for the military academy being so high and the market being so volatile. I worry about the strain on the trust fund. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of calculation. Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "The trust fund?" she asked sharply, her eyes snapping to Robert. "I thought the academy was being paid for out of your bonuses, Robert." That was the agreement. Leo's trust is for his inheritance, not operating expenses. Robert stiffened the wine stain on his cuff, suddenly seeming insignificant compared to the stain spreading across his reputation. He laughed, but it was a hollow, brittle sound. "Of course, Margaret. Claire doesn't understand the finances. She's confused." He shot me a look of pure venom, a silent promise of violence that would have terrified me yesterday. But today, it just looked like desperation. "Actually," I interrupted, moving back to my seat but remaining standing, "I think I understand perfectly. Expenses have been high. The renovations, the cars, the investments." I lingered on the word investments, knowing full well they were gambling debts. Robert slammed his hand down on the table, making the silverware jump. "Enough, Claire. Sit down." The veneer of the polite dinner party was cracking, revealing the ugly structural beams underneath. James shifted uncomfortably, sensing a legal disaster brewing. "Perhaps we should discuss business later," the lawyer suggested weakly. "This is a birthday celebration after all." I looked at Leo, who was watching me with wide, awestruck eyes. He realized I wasn't clumsy. He realized I was fighting back. "You're right, James," I said, a strange, calm smile touching my lips, the first genuine smile I had worn in years. "It is a celebration, and we have a gift to present." I turned slowly toward the sideboard where the leather-bound album lay waiting. "Robert," I said, my voice soft, but carrying the weight of a gavel, "why don't we show Margaret the memories? I think she needs to see exactly what you've been doing for this family." Robert looked at the book, then at me. A flicker of genuine unease crossed his face. He didn't know what was in there, but for the first time, he realized he didn't know me either. Robert stared at the leather-bound album as if it were a coiled snake waiting to strike, his eyes darting between the innocent-looking cover and my impassive face, searching for the trap he knew was there, but couldn't quite see. He was a man accustomed to knowing every variable, to controlling every outcome, but the wine stain on his cuff and the sudden steel-spine defiance of his battered wife had thrown his internal algorithm into chaos. "A walk down memory lane." He repeated the words, tasting like ash in his mouth, but with Margaret watching him with her hawk-like intensity and James leaning forward with polite curiosity, he had no choice but to play the role of the sentimental father. He reached out his hand, hesitating for a microsecond, a tremor of fear that only I caught, before he flipped the heavy cover open, forcing a laugh that sounded like dry leaves crunching underfoot. "Well," he announced, the tension in his shoulders visibly dropping as he saw the first page, "I suppose a little nostalgia never hurt anyone." The first few pages were exactly what he expected: glossy, curated lies of our life together, photos taken by professional photographers, where the lighting was perfect and the smiles were frozen in place by the command of "say cheese," rather than genuine joy. Robert's confidence returned in a rush, inflating his ego like a balloon. He pointed to a picture of him and Leo on a boat in Martha's Vineyard, a trip where he had actually spent the entire time screaming at business partners on the phone while Leo sat alone at the bow. "Ah, look at this, Margaret," he boasted, tapping the photo. "That was the summer I taught the boy how to sail. You remember? Don't you, son? The wind in our hair, just men against the sea." Leo stared at his plate, his knuckles white as he gripped his fork, but he nodded dutifully, conditioned by years of survival. "Yes, father," he whispered. "I remember." Robert beamed, turning another page, emboldened by the safety of the images. "And here the charity gala for the Children's Hospital. We raised $500,000 that night. You see, James? This is the legacy I'm building for him." The tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by the dull hum of polite boredom, and for a moment Robert truly believed he had won again, that my rebellion was just a bluff, a pathetic attempt to rattle him that had fizzled out. He looked at me with a triumphant sneer, a look that said, "Nice try," and moved to close the book, intending to dismiss the gift and return to his meal. But I hadn't endured a night in a freezing cellar to let him close the book on his crimes. "Wait, Robert," I said, my voice cutting through his self-satisfaction like a razor wire. "You haven't shown Margaret the most recent section, the pages at the back. That's where the real investments are." Margaret, sensing the undercurrent of malice in my tone, or perhaps simply bored by Robert's monologue, reached out with her jeweled hand. "Give it here, Robert," she commanded, her voice raspy and imperious. "I want to see my grandson, not 50 pictures of you shaking hands with politicians." Robert hesitated, his grip on the album tightening, an instinctual alarm bell ringing in his head, but refusing his mother-in-law in front of the family lawyer was a social suicide he wasn't willing to commit. Reluctantly, he slid the heavy book across the polished mahogany table, the leather making a soft hissing sound that echoed in the silent dining room. Margaret adjusted her glasses, her face stern, and began to flip through the pages with a speed that made my heart hammer against my ribs. She bypassed the staged portraits, flipping toward the back of the album where the pages were newer, less worn. "Let's see," she muttered. "Leo. Leo. Where is—" She turned a page, and suddenly the rhythm of the paper stopped. A single sheet of paper thinner than the cardstock of the album slipped loose from between two photos and fluttered onto the table, landing face up next to the gravy boat. It wasn't a photograph. It was a bank statement. The stark black and white logo of the Cayman Islands Offshore Holding Company stood out violently against the warm wood of the table, and even from a distance the red negative numbers in the withdrawal column were unmistakable. Margaret frowned confusion, knitting her brow. "What on earth?" she whispered, picking up the paper. Another one slid out as she moved the book, then another, a cascade of financial ruin hidden behind the facade of family happiness. Robert froze, his face draining of color until he looked like a corpse, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Margaret read the first line, her eyes widening behind her thick lenses. "Unauthorized transfer. Leo Ellington Trust. $200,000? Her voice trembled, not with age, but with a sudden dawning horror. She looked up at Robert, the paper shaking in her hand. "Robert, what is this?" "This is dated last Tuesday." James, the lawyer, who had been quietly eating his beef, suddenly snapped into professional mode, his instincts as a shark of the legal world awakening at the scent of blood in the water. He reached over, ignoring all social etiquette, and snatched the second document from the table, a foreclosure notice on a commercial property Robert claimed was thriving, and a gambling marker from a casino in Atlantic City. The room went deathly silent, the kind of silence that precedes an explosion. James adjusted his tie, his eyes scanning the documents with rapid precision, and when he looked up, the deference was gone, replaced by the cold, hard stare of a prosecutor. "These aren't just withdrawals, Margaret," James said, his voice flat and deadly calm. "These are systematic liquidations. The trust fund requires 2 signatures for anything over 10,000, yours and his." He held up a document where Margaret's signature was scrawled at the bottom. "Did you sign this authorization for a business loan 3 months ago?" Margaret stared at the paper, her face turning purple. "I certainly did not," she hissed. James looked at Robert, who was now gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were blue. "Then that," James said, laying the paper down like a winning ace, "is felony forgery and fraud." The silence that followed James's accusation was shattered by a sound so jarring, so incongruous with the gravity of the situation, that it made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Robert laughed. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, nor was it the charming chuckle he used at cocktail parties. It was a wet, jagged sound, desperate and sharp, like breaking glass, the sound of a predator realizing the cage door has slammed shut. He stood up slowly, towering over the table, his shadow stretching long across the ruined feast, and pointed a shaking finger not at the lawyer, but at me. "This is absurd!" He scoffed, his voice booming with a manufactured incredulity, scanning the faces of his audience for an ally he no longer had. "You're going to take the word of a failed waitress and some forged internet printouts over mine. Look at her, Margaret. Look at her eyes. She's been hysterical for weeks. Paranoid. I've been trying to get her help, but she refuses." He leaned over the table, his face twisting into a mask of pity that was more terrifying than his rage. "Claire, darling." He cooed, a sickly sweet tone wrapping around his venom. "Did you print these off to hurt me, because I didn't buy you that new car? Is this about the medication you stopped taking?" For a terrifying second, the room seemed to tilt on its axis as Margaret's gaze flickered between the damning documents and Robert's convincing performance of the aggrieved husband. This was his superpower, the weapon he had wielded against me for years, the ability to twist reality until up became down, until the victim was apologizing for bleeding on the knife. "She's sick, Margaret." Robert pressed on, sensing the hesitation moving around the table to stand behind his mother-in-law's chair, placing his hands on her shoulders in a gesture that looked like comfort, but was clearly restraint. "She's jealous of the memory of your daughter. She's jealous of Leo. She wants to tear this family apart because she knows she never really belonged in it. I kept these episodes private to protect the family name, but clearly I was too lenient." He looked at me with eyes that promised murder while his mouth formed words of concern. "James, put those away. We can discuss Claire's treatment plan later. Right now, I think she needs to go to her room." I didn't move. I didn't blink. I let his words wash over me like dirty water, feeling the sting of them, but no longer drowning in them because the truth was a life raft I had finally climbed onto. "I didn't print them, Robert." I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the room with the weight of a stone dropping into a deep well. "I took them from the safe behind the pantry, the one you told me was broken." Robert froze, his hands tightening on Margaret's shoulders until she winced. "You don't know the combination," he snarled, dropping the act for a fraction of a second. "It's your birthday, Robert," I replied, holding his gaze steadily. "Because you love yourself too much to use any other numbers. And I didn't go in there because I was jealous. I went in there because at 3:00 a.m. this morning, after 12 hours in the dark, I decided that stealing was a lesser sin than letting you destroy your son." Margaret shifted under Robert's grip, shrugging him off with a sudden sharp movement, her instincts as a mother finally overriding her prejudice as a snob. "12 hours in the dark," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "What are you talking about, Claire?" Robert tried to intervene, his voice rising in panic. "She's hallucinating, Margaret. I told you she's unwell." But I stood up then, slowly, deliberately pushing my chair back, with a scrape of wood against wood that sounded like a gavel. "He didn't burn the money because he hates money, Margaret," I said, walking around the table toward her, ignoring Robert's threatening step in my direction. "He spent the money. But he burned Leo's art. He burned his future. And when I tried to pull the sketchbook out of the fire, when I tried to save the one thing your grandson loves." I stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could smell the antiseptic ointment beneath my expensive perfume. "Robert said I was clumsy." I continued, my eyes locking with Margaret's, seeing the confusion and fear warring behind her spectacles. "He told you I spilled the wine because I was shaking. He told you I'm sick." I reached for the buttons on my left cuff, the silk cool and smooth against my fingertips, a stark contrast to the throbbing heat beneath. "But I'm not sick, Margaret, and I'm not clumsy." With a swift, decisive motion, I unbuttoned the sleeve and pushed the fabric up to my elbow. The gasp that escaped Margaret's lips was audible, a sharp intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the room. There, exposed under the harsh light of the chandelier, was the truth, that no amount of charm could cover the angry red blisters spanning across my palm and fingers, the raw peeling skin where the fire had kissed me, and the distinct purple bruising around my wrist where Robert had dragged me to the cellar. "This is the price of your investments," I said, holding my mangled hand out for her inspection, a gruesome exhibit in the court of family dinner. He threw the book in the fire. I pulled it out, and for saving a few pieces of paper, he locked me in the wine cellar all night. No shoes, no coat. Just the threat that if I made a sound, he would send Leo away to a place where they break boys like horses. I turned my arm, showing the fingerprint bruises that matched the size of Robert's hands perfectly. "Look at it, Margaret. Really look at it. This isn't clumsy. This is punishment." The room fell into a deathly silence, the kind where you can hear a heart breaking. Margaret looked from my ruined hand to Robert's pristine, manicured fingers connecting the dots that she had willfully ignored for a decade. The disdain in her eyes evaporated, replaced by a horror so profound it made her look 10 years older in a single second. She didn't look at me as a gold digger anymore. She looked at me as a fellow casualty. The silence in the dining room was shattered not by a scream, but by the sharp cracking sound of flesh striking flesh, a noise so violent and definitive that it seemed to echo off the vaulted ceiling. Margaret, the woman who had spent a lifetime adhering to the rigid social codes of the upper class, had risen from her chair with a speed that defied her age and delivered a backhanded slap across Robert's face that carried the weight of 10 years of deception. The impact was brutal. The large diamond on her ring finger caught his cheekbone, leaving a jagged red scratch that instantly began to bead with blood, marking him like cattle. "You monster!" She spat, her voice, trembling not with frailty but with a volcanic rage that had finally found its vent. "I entrusted you with my daughter's memory. I entrusted you with my grandson's future. And you starved them. You beat them." She looked at my burned hand again, tears finally spilling over the rim of her glasses. "I thought she was weak," she whispered to me, her voice breaking. "I thought you were just another gold digger trying to replace my Elizabeth. But you've been taking the blows for him." Robert stumbled back, clutching his cheek, his eyes wide with shock that quickly curdled into a dark, blind fury. For a narcissist, physical pain is nothing compared to the agony of public humiliation, and looking at the blood on his hand, he realized his reign was over. The facade of the benevolent patriarch dissolved completely, revealing the cornered rat beneath. He didn't look at Margaret. He looked at me. In his twisted logic, I was the architect of his downfall, the traitor who had dared to bite the hand that barely fed me. "You did this," he hissed, his voice dropping to a guttural growl, ignoring the blood dripping onto his collar. "I took you out of the gutter. I gave you a home. I gave you a name. And this is how you repay me, by turning my own family against me with your lies." He wasn't seeing the room anymore. He wasn't seeing the lawyer or the grandmother. He only saw the object of his possession that had malfunctioned. His hands curled into fists, the knuckles turning white, and I saw the muscles in his neck coil. "I should have left you in that cellar to rot," he roared, and then, with a terrifying burst of speed, he lunged across the corner of the table, aiming straight for my throat. I flinched instinctively, raising my injured hands to protect my face, bracing for the impact that I knew from experience would be crushing. But the blow never landed. A blur of movement flashed between us, and suddenly Robert was shoved backward with a force that sent him crashing into the sideboard, knocking the vase of lilies to the floor in a spray of water and glass. I lowered my hands to see Leo standing in front of me, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't the cowering boy who had stared at his plate an hour ago. He was standing at his full height, which I suddenly realized was 2 inches taller than his father. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes, a mixture of terror and fierce, unwavering protection, was louder than any scream. He stood like a human shield, blocking Robert's path to me, his body trembling not from cowardice but from the adrenaline of breaking the ultimate taboo, challenging the alpha. "Don't you touch her?" Leo said, his voice cracking slightly but gaining strength with every syllable. "Don't you ever touch her again." Robert pulled himself up from the sideboard, water dripping from his jacket, staring at his son as if he were looking at a stranger. "You ungrateful little brat," Robert sneered, wiping the blood from his cheek. "Get out of my way. I'm doing this for you. She's poisoned you against me." He took a step forward, raising his hand as if to backhand Leo, the way he had done 1,000 times before. "Move, or I'll—" "You'll what?" Leo interrupted, stepping forward instead of back, invading Robert's personal space. "You'll send me to school. You'll cut me off. Go ahead. I don't want your money. And I don't want your name." Leo grabbed my arm, gently pulling me further behind him, his grip firm and reassuring. "She's the only mother I've had for 10 years. If you want to get to her, you have to go through me." The standoff was broken by the calm, authoritative voice of James, who was standing by the window, his cell phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, 911, I need to report a domestic assault in progress at the Ellington estate, 44 Oak Lane. Yes, the perpetrator is still on the premises. He is violent." James locked eyes with Robert, his expression cold and professional. "I'd advise you to sit down, Robert. The police are already at the gatehouse. I texted the security code 5 minutes ago." Robert froze, the color draining from his face as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. The threat of violence evaporated, replaced by the sheer paralyzing terror of consequences. He looked at the door, then at the window, realizing there was no exit. The sound of sirens began to bleed into the room, faint at first, then growing louder, a rising wail that signaled the end of his tyranny. The blue and red lights began to flash against the dining room walls, dancing over the ruined beef Wellington and the scattered financial documents, turning the scene into a surreal, strobe-lit nightmare. Robert slumped into a chair, not the head of the table, but a side chair, looking small and defeated. He put his head in his hands, muttering to himself, "My reputation, my reputation." Even now, unable to process the human cost of his actions. I stepped out from behind Leo, placing my hand on his shoulder. He turned to me, his eyes wet, and buried his face in my neck, sobbing like the child he had never been allowed to be. I wrapped my bandaged arms around him, feeling the pain in my burns but caring less about it than I ever had. Across the room, Margaret walked over to us. She didn't say anything. She just placed her hand on my back and began to rub it in slow, soothing circles. We stood there, a united front of 3 generations, watching the front door as the heavy thud of police boots echoed in the foyer, coming to take the monster away. The 2 officers who stepped into the dining room were young, their uniforms stiff and smelling of rain and polyester, a stark blue-collar contrast to the curated elegance of the Ellington estate, and for a moment they seemed hesitant to disrupt the tableau of wealth before them. But James stepped forward, his voice clipping through the hesitation with professional efficiency. "That is Mr. Ellington. And those—" he pointed to the documents scattered on the table like confetti from a party in hell, "are the evidence of felony fraud and domestic abuse." Robert didn't run. Men like Robert don't run because they believe the rules of gravity don't apply to them until they hit the ground. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket with a trembling hand, attempting to summon the ghost of his authority. "Officers, this is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice pitching too high, cracking under the weight of his fear. "My wife is having a mental episode. I was just trying to restrain her." The older officer didn't blink, didn't smile, just reached for his belt. "Turn around, sir," he said, his tone bored and absolute. "Hands behind your back." Robert gasped, a sound of pure indignity. "Do you know who I am? I am a donor to the policeman's ball. I want the chief on the phone." The click of the handcuffs was softer than I imagined it would be, a small metallic snick that sounded less like a lock closing and more like a heavy chain breaking. Robert flinched as the cold metal bit into his wrists, his face flushing a deep mottled crimson that clashed with the blood drying on his cheek. He looked at James, then at Margaret, his eyes wide and pleading, stripped of all their shark-like malice, revealing the terrified child beneath. "Margaret, please." He begged, the dignity completely gone now. "Don't let them do this. Think of the scandal. Think of the family name." Margaret leaned heavily on her cane, her face carved from granite. "I am thinking of the family name Robert," she said, her voice ice cold. "That is why I am letting them take the trash out." The officer guided Robert toward the door, his hand firm on the back of his expensive Italian suit, pushing him forward. Robert stumbled, his feet tangling in the rug, and for the first time in 10 years he looked small. He looked pathetic. And I realized with a jolt of shock that the monster I had feared was just a man, and a weak one at that. We followed them to the foyer, Leo gripping my hand so tight I thought my bones might snap, but I welcomed the pressure. It grounded me. The front door was wide open, framing the driveway like a stage, and beyond the flashing red and blue lights of the cruiser, I could see the silhouettes of the neighbors gathering on their lawns. Mrs. Higgins from next door was there, clutching her robe, her eyes wide with the scandalous delight of the bored upper class. Robert saw them too. He saw the audience he had spent a lifetime trying to impress, now witnessing his ultimate humiliation. He tried to duck his head to hide his face, but the officer held him upright. Just before they pushed him into the back of the cruiser, Robert dug his heels into the gravel and twisted his body around to look at me one last time. I expected him to scream, to curse, to rage. But he just stared at me with dead shark eyes, his voice a low, venomous hiss that cut through the night air. "You'll starve without me, Claire," he whispered, a final attempt to plant a seed of doubt in my garden. "You're nothing. You don't know how to survive in the real world." I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. I stood on the porch of the house that had been my prison, the wind blowing my hair across my face, and I looked him dead in the eye. "I survived you," I said, my voice steady and clear, loud enough for Leo to hear, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, loud enough for the universe to hear. "Everything else is easy?" The officer pushed his head down, a gesture of dismissal usually reserved for common criminals, and shoved him into the back seat. The door slammed shut, sealing him inside a cage of wire mesh and hard plastic. The engine roared, the lights spun one last time, illuminating the faces of the stunned neighbors, and then the car pulled away, taking the darkness with it. We stood there for a long time, watching the taillights fade until they were just red pinpricks in the distance, swallowed by the suburban night. The silence that rushed back in to fill the void wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the last decade. It was a vast, empty silence. It was the silence of a battlefield after the guns have stopped firing. It was terrifying, and it was beautiful. We walked back inside, the adrenaline finally crashing out of my system, leaving my legs feeling like lead. The house felt different. Larger, colder, but cleaner. The air didn't smell like fear anymore. It just smelled of the burnt roast and spilled wine. I slumped onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, my knees giving out, and Leo sat down next to me, resting his head on my shoulder, his tears soaking into the silk of my dress. Margaret stood in the center of the foyer, looking around at the wreckage of the evening, the shattered vase, the muddy footprints of the police, the ruined dinner. She looked old, tired, and stripped of her armor. She walked over to us slowly, the tapping of her cane echoing on the marble, and stopped in front of me. She didn't look at Leo. She looked directly at my hands resting in my lap, the bandages stained with soot and grease. "I have the best divorce lawyer in the state on speed dial," Margaret said, her voice gruff, struggling with the unfamiliar weight of humility. "He usually represents my business partners, but tomorrow morning he works for you." She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line as she fought back a sob that threatened to break her composure. She reached out, her hand hovering over my injured one, afraid to touch it, afraid to cause more pain. I misjudged you, Claire," she whispered, the words coming out choked and rough. "I thought you wanted his money. I didn't know you were paying for it with your blood." She looked up, meeting my eyes with a fierce, steely determination. "He said you would starve. You won't." Not as long as I am breathing. You protected my blood when I was too blind to see it. She took a deep breath, straightening her spine. Now let me call a doctor. We need to look at those hands. The private doctor Margaret summoned arrived within the hour, a quiet, silver-haired man who smelled of antiseptic and old leather, treating the dining room table like a field triage unit as he gently peeled away the crude bandages I had fashioned from silk scarves. For the first time in years, someone touched me, not to take, not to hurt, but to heal. And the sensation of the cool, soothing burn cream being applied to my blistered palms was so overwhelming that I had to bite my lip to keep from sobbing. Margaret sat across from me, her cane resting against her knee, watching the procedure with an unflinching, morbid fascination, forcing herself to witness every layer of damaged skin as a penance for her blindness. Second-degree burns. The doctor murmured, his voice low and devoid of judgment, though his eyes lingered on the bruise on my wrist with professional suspicion. And signs of hypothermia. You need rest, hydration, and safety. He wrapped my hands in pristine white gauze, the stark brightness of the bandages making my hands look like the paws of a wounded animal, and for the first time I didn't feel the urge to hide them. When he packed his bag to leave, he handed me a bottle of painkillers, but I set them aside. I didn't want to numb the pain. I wanted to feel it. The throbbing in my hands was the only proof I had that the battle was real, that I had actually won, and that the monster wasn't just hiding under the bed waiting for the lights to go out. The front door clicked shut behind the doctor and Margaret, who had insisted on staying in the guest wing tonight, just in case, leaving the house suspended in a strange, ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise of the argument. You know, that specific kind of emptiness that fills a house after a funeral, where the furniture seems to hold its breath and the air feels thin. That was the Ellington estate now, a mausoleum built to the ego of a man who was currently sitting in a holding cell, stripped of his Armani suit and his dignity. I walked through the living room, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood, and every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system, a phantom reflex honed by a decade of walking on eggshells. The ice maker in the kitchen clattered, dropping a cube into the bin, and I physically flinched, my heart hammering against my ribs, spinning around to apologize to a man who wasn't there. It was a cruel biological joke. My mind knew he was gone, but my body was still living in the blast zone, waiting for the next explosion. I stood there in the hallway, trembling at the sound of the refrigerator, realizing that while the police had taken Robert away, they hadn't taken the fear. That would take longer to evict. It hung in the curtains, lived in the carpets, and slept in the master bedroom upstairs, a ghost that I would have to exorcise one room at a time. I found Leo in the solarium, sitting on the edge of the velvet chaise lounge, still wearing that ridiculous stiff suit his father had forced him into, looking like a miniature broken version of the man we had just exiled. He was staring out at the dark garden, his hands resting on his knees, and when he heard me approach, he didn't jump. He just turned his head slowly, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. I thought... He started, his voice cracking. Then he cleared his throat and tried again. I thought he was going to kill you, Claire. When he picked up that knife, I really thought that was it. I sat down next to him, careful not to bump my bandaged hands against him, and let out a long, shuddering breath. He wanted to... I admitted the truth hanging between us like a physical object. But you stopped him. You stood up. You were 10 feet tall, Leo. He looked down at his hands, ashamed. I should have done it sooner. I shouldn't have let him hurt you for so long. I shook my head, leaning my forehead against his shoulder. You were a child, Leo. You were surviving. That's all any of us were doing. But you aren't a child anymore. And you aren't a businessman either. I reached out and tugged gently at the knot of his silk tie. Take this off. It's choking you. Leo's hands shook as he undid the tie, pulling the silk strip from his neck and letting it fall to the floor like a dead snake, a symbolic shedding of the skin his father had tried to graft onto him. He unbuttoned the top collar of his shirt and took a deep, greedy breath of air as if he were breathing for the first time in 18 years. The sketchbook, he whispered, looking at the fireplace where the ashes of his drawing still lay cold and gray. He burned it. The portfolio. It's gone. The art school won't take me without it. I smiled a small, tired curve of my lips and nudged him with my elbow. You have hands, don't you? You have eyes. I nodded toward the glass walls of the solarium, where the moon was casting long skeletal shadows across the lawn. The portfolio was just paper, Leo. The talent is in you. You have all summer to draw. And this time you won't have to hide your pencils under the mattress. You can paint in the middle of the living room if you want to. You can paint on the walls for all I care. Leo looked at me, a spark of hope igniting in the ashes of his gaze. Really, you think? Margaret will pay for it. I laughed softly. Margaret just saw her son-in-law dragged out in handcuffs for fraud. I think she'd be happy if you decided to become a mime, as long as you don't become Robert. We walked back into the kitchen, the scene of the crime where the remnants of the failed celebration still lay scattered across the counters, like the debris of a shipwreck. The beef Wellington, once the pinnacle of culinary perfection, sat on the platter cold and congealed the pink meat, turning a dull gray surrounded by the dried splashes of the wine I had spilled. It looked disgusting, a greasy monument to the performative perfection I had enslaved myself to for years. I looked at the oven, the knives, the copper pots hanging from the rack tools that had been weaponized against me, demands for a level of service that was never enough. I'm not cleaning this up, Leo said, looking at the mess with distaste. We should hire someone. I shook my head, stepping forward. No, I need to do this. I need to clear the table. I picked up the heavy platter with my bandaged hands, ignoring the twinge of pain, and walked to the large trash bin. I didn't scrape the food off. I simply let the entire roast, the expensive pastry, the truffle pâté slide into the garbage with a heavy, wet thud. It was a sacrilege against cuisine, but a sacrament for my soul. I turned to the sink where the bottle of Chateau Margaux Robert's prized vintage worth more than my first car sat open on the counter. Robert had worshipped this wine. He had cared more about the temperature of his cellar than the temperature of his wife's heart. I picked up the bottle, feeling its weight, the cool glass slick in my gauze-wrapped grip. Leo watched me, silent and wide-eyed, as I uncorked it fully and tipped it over the drain. The dark red liquid glugged out, swirling into the stainless steel basin like old blood splashing against the metal with a violent purging rhythm. It smelled of oak and berries and money, but as it disappeared down the black hole of the disposal, it just looked like waste. I poured until the bottle was empty, until the last drop shook free, and then I dropped the empty glass bottle into the recycling bin, with a satisfying final crash that echoed through the empty kitchen. I turned to Leo, wiping my hands on a dish towel, and saw him smiling, a real smile. So, I said, looking at the empty counter, who wants to order a pizza? The seasons changed with the subtlety that I had never been allowed to notice before, the oppressive gray of that endless winter melting away into a spring that felt reckless and vibrant, bursting with a green so bright it almost hurt my eyes. 6 months have passed since the night the blue lights flashed in the driveway, and the Ellington estate, once a museum of cold marble and terrified silence, has been colonized by the messy, chaotic business of actually living. The pristine white carpets in the living room, which I used to vacuum twice a day in fear of a single speck of dust, are now speckled with dried droplets of acrylic paint and charcoal dust, the permanent footprints of Leo's acceptance into the Rhode Island School of Design. I stood on the patio with a mug of coffee that I didn't rush to drink, listening to the morning sounds that used to be forbidden, the hum of the radio from the kitchen, where the window was cracked open, the scratching of a pencil against paper, and the absence of heavy footsteps. There is a specific kind of freedom in being able to hear a car door slam outside and not feel your heart stop, a rewiring of the nervous system that happens slowly day by day as the body realizes it no longer needs to be a coiled spring waiting for the blow. I walked back inside to the kitchen island, where the morning mail lay in a disorganized pile, another small rebellion against Robert's rigid sorting systems, and my eyes snagged on a plain white envelope with the return address of the state correctional facility stamped in red ink. It was the third one this month. The first time I saw his handwriting, that sharp, aggressive scrawl, I had a panic attack so severe I had to sit on the floor for 20 minutes. The second time, I felt a surge of nausea. But today, looking at it, I felt nothing but a dull, distant pity, like looking at a roadkill that can no longer bite. I didn't open it. I knew what it would say, because narcissists only have one script. He would alternate between weeping for his lost reputation, blaming me for his moment of weakness, and promising that he had found God in his cell and forgave me for betraying him. I picked up the envelope not with fear but with the casual indifference one reserves for junk mail, and dropped it into the recycling bin right on top of the empty carton of orange juice. He didn't deserve the drama of being burned in the fireplace. He belonged with the refuse processed and forgotten. "You're not going to read it." A voice came from the doorway, raspy and dry. Margaret stood there leaning on her cane, but she looked different too. The fur coats were gone, replaced by a sensible cashmere cardigan, and the perpetual sneer had softened into a look of grudging respect. "She comes over every Sunday now, not to inspect the dust, but to sit for Leo, who is painting a series of portraits titled The Matriarch." "I know what it says, Margaret," I replied, pouring her a cup of tea exactly the way she likes it, not because I have to, but because I want to. "He says he's the victim. He says he misses the roast beef." Margaret snorted a sound that was unladylike and wonderful as she took the cup with a nod of thanks. "The lawyer called this morning," she said, taking a sip and looking out at the garden. "The assets have been unfrozen. The restitution for the trust fund is secured, and the divorce decree is on the table. You just need to sign." She paused, her eyes flickering to my hands. "And the house. The house is in your name, Claire. I made sure of it. Consider it back pay for the job you never applied for." I looked around the kitchen at the copper pots that no longer terrified me, at the light streaming in through the windows I had cleaned. For a long time I thought I would sell this place, burn it down, run away to a small apartment in the city where no one knew my name. But then I realized that leaving would be another form of running, another way of letting him dictate where I could exist. Taking this house, filling it with Leo's art and Margaret's grumpy kindness and the smell of cheap pizza was the ultimate victory. It was reclaiming the territory. "Thank you, Margaret," I said softly. She waved her hand dismissively, though I saw the flush of emotion on her neck. "Don't get sentimental, Claire. I just can't have my grandson coming home from college to a rental. And besides," she tapped her cane on the floor, "I need someone to make sure the gardener doesn't plant those hideous petunias again." She turned to leave the room to find Leo, but stopped in the doorway. "He would have destroyed him, you know," she said, not looking back. "If you hadn't stepped in. You didn't just save the money, you saved the boy." I finished my coffee and walked out to the solarium, the place where the sun hit the hardest. Leo was there, wrestling with a massive canvas, his face smudged with blue paint, singing along off-key to a song blasting from his phone. He looked up when I entered, grinning, a wide, unencumbered smile that reached his eyes that used to be constantly checking the exits. "Hey," he said, gesturing with a brush. "I think I finally got the shading right on the hands. Come look." I walked over and looked at the painting. It wasn't a portrait of Margaret. It was a study of hands, two hands reaching into a fire to pull out a book. The fire was painted in violent, swirling oranges and reds, terrifying and consuming, but the hands were painted in gold. They weren't victims' hands. They were warriors' hands. They were strong, enduring, and beautiful in their damage. I stared at the canvas, tears pricking my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling of being seen, truly seen for the first time. I looked down at my own hands resting on the easel. The bandages were long gone, replaced by shiny pink scar tissue that webbed across my palms and curled around my fingers. The doctors said they would fade with time, that I could get laser surgery to smooth them out to make them look normal again. But as I traced the lines of the burns, feeling the raised texture of my survival, I knew I would never erase them. They were my map. They were the receipt for the price I had paid to buy our freedom. I looked at Leo, who was waiting anxiously for my verdict. "It's perfect, Leo," I whispered, reaching out to ruffle his messy hair, something Robert would have killed me for doing. "It's absolutely perfect." I walked out into the garden, the sun warm on my face, and for the first time in my life, the silence wasn't waiting for a scream. It was just silence. And it was mine.